thanks to Stephen and to CEDA for inviting me along to contribute to the discussions today. And many thanks to friends and colleagues who've also come along to be here today, and to EY for sponsoring the event, and EY as a very valued member of the Business Council. So, as you may know, today the Business Council is releasing a discussion paper on transforming the tax system. And at this point, can I acknowledge the extraordinary work led by Jennifer and the BCA team. The work that's gone into this paper is, it's measured in man-years almost. It's very thorough, it's very rigorous, and is a real credit to the team. But before going into detail, let's step back and ask, why are we even talking about this? What's the context? The context is no less than creating a sustainable future for the country. And as Alf has indicated, the Business Council has always seen itself as playing the long game on what is right for Australia, and is committed to advocating for good policy design. That's our core role. We seek to describe the conditions that will drive economic growth, remembering that it's primarily business that creates wealth, jobs, and the capacity for reinvestment. The Business Council has a major stake in this. 1 in 10 working Australians are employed by a BCA member company, and 10 million people overall are employed in the business sector. Now, our vision for Australia was set out in considerable detail in our Action Plan for Enduring Prosperity, which we released in 2013. Key elements of that vision include for Australia to return to a 3.5% average annual GDP growth, not because it's a magical number, but because if we are to maintain living standards, we should target nothing less than the rate of growth Australia has experienced over the last 25 years. For labour productivity growth to return to 1990 levels, because without it, as our terms of trade level off or continue to decline, there are a few other levers to achieve GDP and wages growth. The productivity task requires a commitment to investment and innovation-led growth. For real income growth to increase to the historical average of 1.9% per annum at a minimum, and for the combination to see this country being ranked in the top 5 comparable industrialised countries in the world for real GDP per capita. A growing economy is the only path to delivering social progress in areas such as job creation, health outcomes, educational attainment, and quality of life infrastructure. And while the policy imperatives identified in the Action Plan remain as relevant today as when released, the reality is that our degrees of freedom for phased implementation have narrowed. We developed our action plan with acute recognition of the profound changes underway, both in the global economy and as a consequence in the Australian economy. We've often highlighted that these changes include the disaggregation of global supply chains, with 75% of all global trade now in intermediate goods and services and capital goods, not finished goods. Then there's the extraordinary impact of smartphones, introduced only as recently as 2007, and enabling access to the mobile internet. And of course, what that has meant in terms of disruption of traditional business models is something that every business is experiencing. And then finally, the increasing, if not accelerating, mobility of companies and individuals. So we can't stress strongly enough the depth, the scale, and the speed of these changes and the transition that our economy must make. Our concern is that for as long as the current tax debate is merely a daily commentary on individual tax measures, we risk losing sight of the core objective, which is to underpin a transitioning economy seeking to regain its growth trajectory. It's therefore essential that we are systematic in our approach and that we return to the tried and tested framework for the development of good public policy, which includes 4 essential steps. First is having a vision such as the one that I've just outlined, which defines the desired future state. then identifying clear policy objectives that deliver that vision, recognising the problems that need to be solved in order to achieve those objectives, and then putting forward a set of incremental, coherent, purposeful and feasible policy actions to take the country past the problems and towards the vision, with all of these actions anchored in first principles. In a sense, you could look at this process through the lens of the business model for the country. Good businesses have a vision of where they want to get to. They put in place strategies to get there, and they implement those strategies through a detailed and coherent set of actions. At all times, they maintain a view of the overall shape of the business model, which encompasses how the business is going to generate revenue, that is, how it's going to grow, the capabilities needed in the organisation to deliver that growth, and crucially, the reinvestment capacity of the business needed to make the business model sustainable. So what of Australia's business model in the context of the vision that we articulated? Well, there is strong agreement that the next wave of growth must be innovation-led. This is acknowledged by both major political parties in key position papers, specifically the government's National Innovation and Science Agenda and the opposition's Powering Innovation Agenda. And the importance of innovation-led growth was also endorsed at the August 2015 National Reform Summit by representatives from the community sector, the trade union movement, and small and large business. So if we're agreed on the need for innovation-led growth, in business we'd refer to this as top-line revenue growth, what are the capabilities we need, recognising that in a globalised world these capabilities need to reference the global context? Well, we need to be globally competitive in terms of education and skills, we need capable people, and we need them to be engaged in the economy. We need vibrant, agile, growing businesses because the country makes money when business makes money. We particularly need business to be competitive in key sectors where we have a comparative advantage, an approach that's being advanced through the Industry Growth Centre's policy framework, which followed on from the BCA's 2014 report on building Australia's comparative advantages. We need foreign investment, though with an emphasis on investment which brings mutuality and reciprocity of benefit. And we need regulatory settings which provide encouragement and incentive for the development of the capabilities that I've just described. One of these regulatory settings is tax. Our tax system is one controllable factor in a volatile, unpredictable global economy. If our tax system is not conducive to people productively engaging in the economy or businesses investing, innovating and creating jobs, and if it's compromising the nation's global competitiveness, then the system is undermining our national business model. That's why Australia is talking about tax. And while my focus today is on tax, I'll also refer to fiscal policy because of the irrevocable interdependency between revenue and expenses. So returning to the framework for good policy development, and recognising that a tax system which reinforces and complements our national capabilities is essential for delivering our national vision, the next step is identifying the problems with the current tax system. The characteristics of a good tax system include that it's stable and predictable, it provides incentive to work and to participate, it creates the business environment for companies to invest and expand, and it facilitates initiatives around innovation-led growth such as research and development, entrepreneurship and risk-taking. The problems we now have include major issues with the structure. We are overly reliant on a volatile, narrow base of income taxes, both personal and company. Not many people realise, but 12 companies pay 33% of all company tax, and 3% of individual taxpayers pay almost 30% of personal tax. This is a very narrow base. And personal income taxes are increasingly inequitable due to bracket creep. So if we're committed as a nation to a progressive tax system, nothing could be more regressive than the impact of bracket creep. Our rate of company tax is one of the most uncompetitive in the world, adding to our already failing competitiveness. And the complexity and inefficiency of the system has 10 taxes raising 90% of revenue, while the remaining 115 taxes impose significant compliance costs for very little revenue yield. And these problems have consequences. taxation can either be an accelerant or an impediment to economic growth, and in our case, it's increasingly an impediment. We see this in decisions made at the margin by business and by individuals. A lower rate of company tax would reduce the after-tax cost of capital, lower the hurdle rate for investment, and lead to an increase in business investments that drive innovation alongside productivity growth and job creation, both of which flow from innovation. In the course of consultations for EY's report, Tax Reform, A Better Way, former Oceania Managing Partner and CEO Rob McLeod emphasised how much the headline rate of tax really matters, and it matters for both individuals and companies. Remembering, therefore, the importance of applying first principles, every adjustment we make to the tax system, even if incremental, must be part of a staged restructuring of tax arrangements, which lowers the overall burden on families and business, decreases our reliance on a narrow base, removes the most inefficient taxes, and improves simplicity, integrity, and transparency. The Business Council has always envisaged at least the following three elements. On personal income tax, changes to thresholds to tackle bracket creep and to encourage workforce effort, participation, and entrepreneurship. A lowering of the company tax rate to 25%, noting that this will simply align Australia with the OECD average. And let me pause here to make an important comment. On integrity, the Business Council's strong position is that companies must meet their tax obligations, and where arrangements do not keep pace with community norms, they should be reviewed. Robust integrity measures are an integral complement to more competitive business tax arrangements, but we must support tax transparency that is fit for purpose. We support the need to address the multinational tax issues, but to use this issue to characterise all companies as underpaying their tax is disingenuous at best and potentially very damaging if it obscures the importance of making our rate of company tax more competitive. On Treasury's assessment, 2/3 of the benefits of company tax reductions flow to Australian households, primarily through higher real wages. And for a small, open economy, it's inconceivable with our current company tax settings that we can return to a 3.5% growth rate and all the benefits that flow from it in terms of jobs, wages, and living standards. If we come back to our first principles and our focus on growth in national income, a more competitive company tax rate is non-negotiable. But back to our elements and the third of our reform elements, and that's at a state level. Our suggested tax package will see a gradual shift from stamp duties and insurance taxes to carefully designed land taxes and harmonised payroll taxes. There's unassailable evidence that stamp duties and insurance taxes are among the most damaging to the economy, and stamp duties are also highly volatile given their reliance on the property market. In summary, if Australia does not pursue a package of the kind we're advocating, the community deserves to understand the implications for the position that we'll be in by 2025. 43% of Australian taxpayers will be in the top two income tax brackets. Income's growth will slow to an average rate of 0.9% per year, compared with the growth rate of 2.3% that Australians have enjoyed over the past 13 years. Our company tax rate will be increasingly uncompetitive internationally, given the strong indications from other countries that their rates will be further reduced from their already competitive position. To choose not to embark on a process of restructuring the tax system in the way we and many others are suggesting is akin to the then former Treasury Secretary Martin Parkinson's description of sleepwalking our way into lower living standards. The question is how to fund it. In an ideal world, all of these issues would be addressed through a holistic transformation of the system. The Business Council believes that the GST could have been a potential source of funding, with appropriate compensation to ensure that low-income households would have been no worse off. An increased reliance on a consumption tax would also deliver an important structural benefit by reducing our reliance on more volatile direct income taxes and by addressing the narrowness of our base. However, If the GST is not an option in the medium term, we need to find another path through. And thus we would support a pragmatic approach based on 3 clear horizons of adjustment. And while the changes that we've set out will set us on the right path and boost economic growth, the long-term structural work will still need to be done. Over time, we will need to address the balance of direct and indirect taxation, the challenges of an increasingly digitised economy with new classes of assets, and the challenges of an ageing demographic which will see fewer people working and therefore fewer people paying tax. But we have to start somewhere, and we have to set ourselves on the right course. The first 2 horizons that we're proposing need to be tackled within 1 and 5 years respectively, and our paper includes a menu of options around how to fund them through careful changes to concessions that improve policy design and provide structural correction to the system. Horizon 3 moves us much closer to our destination, with the growth dividend from the lower rates in Horizons 1 and 2 starting to flow through, giving the nation choices. Our paper sets this out in some detail, but let me provide a snapshot of what we are proposing. So, summarising the actions in Horizon 1 and 2 together, within 5 years we suggest implementing moderate personal income tax, and in Horizon 1 we should focus on low and middle income taxpayers affected by bracket creep, that is, people earning between $37,000 and $87,000. Within the same 5-year timeframe, we would move on a glide path to a more competitive company tax rate of 25%, and in Horizon 1, we should immediately correct for the current anomaly of having 2 company tax rates by harmonising the rate to 28.5%. The current arrangement is distortionary and fails to come to terms with the ecosystem of the interactions between businesses of different sizes. Britain tried this approach and has since corrected the mistake. It's just bad policy. And the glide path to a rate of 25% cannot afford to be a spurious promise. To have an impact on business investment decisions, it must be legislated, with the proviso, as is the case in the UK, that Parliament has the flexibility to adjust if global circumstances change dramatically. So back to the question of how to pay for these changes. Well, we're not the Treasury, but we believe there are concessional arrangements which should be considered. It's the job of Treasury to model potential adjustments and identify the 5-year cash flow assumptions. This is a complex task, and there will be choices about how we calibrate the pace of change depending on how quickly the benefits from these adjustments flow into the economy. It's also Treasury's job to chart thoughtful transition over time and across generations at a point in time, and to understand potential unintended consequences. It is most important in redesigning concessions, even those which provide a revenue dividend, that the objective must be to improve tax policy and the design of that policy and the structure of the tax system, not to fund additional spending. In our paper, we have set out some of these design parameters. Now, turning to Horizon 3, which takes us to 2025, actions would be underpinned by progress made in the previous 2 horizons and would include an ongoing glide path to take the company tax rate down to 22%, a restructuring of the personal income tax and transfer interface to address the marginal tax rate issue and provide greater incentives to work, and steps to rebalance the mix between direct and indirect taxes, including a well-designed compensation package. If we move through these 3 horizons purposefully and systematically, the growth dividend over time could be considerable. And while we can debate the impact of a company tax reduction, and all of the modelling suggests it could be in the order of a 9 billion increase in GDP, it is important to consider the consequence of the counterfactual, that is, no change in the company tax rate. Doing nothing doesn't mean that nothing will happen. Increasingly, mobile company investment decisions will be attracted by more competitive rates in other jurisdictions. There'll be an erosion of the intellectual property developed in Australia. There'll be less and less formation of new businesses, and therefore fewer and fewer employment opportunities, particularly for young mobile people. I've already quoted one former Treasury Secretary, Martin Parkinson, on living standards. Another, Ted Evans, made a similar point in saying that a nation can choose the level of unemployment it's willing to bear. As you can see from this slide, the dividend from achieving a higher growth rate compared with accepting the rate we have now is substantial. Our nation's economy could be $1.5 trillion greater, which represents an entirely different scenario from the current forecasts in terms of resilience, reinvestment capability, and most importantly, living standards. As I mentioned at the start, the other side of the tax story is our fiscal arrangements, and as with any business model, there are deep interdependencies. And again, just to be very clear, the purpose of tax reform is not to raise overall levels of revenue simply to fund additional spending. Australia has a structural overspending problem, and raising the overall level of taxation would not solve this. Over the last 10 years, spending has exceeded our rate of GDP growth, and the intergenerational report forecasts this will continue, with real annual GDP growth at 2.7% and annual spending growth at 3.6%. This is just unsustainable. We have made poor spending choices in health and education as the standout examples, as in we could have had better outcomes for the same expenditure, and we continue to make substantial expenditure commitments on new programs, exacerbating the overall deficit. We have no choice but to face up to the deficit challenge. It's compromising our capacity to pay for the services people need today and our capacity to make investments at the national level which will underpin future wealth generation, whether that's in physical infrastructure or knowledge infrastructure. Failing to address the deficit also makes Australia vulnerable to global economic shocks, and should these eventuate, we may find ourselves having to make unpalatable choices. If our business model is social progress afforded by generating long-term economic wealth, making such unpalatable choices is unacceptable and would represent a failure of our business model. And comparing our situation favourably against weaker economies is hollow comfort. No business experiencing difficulties would excuse inaction by pointing to another business that's experiencing even greater challenges. And if I return to the business model interdependencies, addressing these fiscal issues will actually increase our capacity to move through our 3 horizons of structural tax reform. Now, all of this involves choices and trade-offs, and the politics is hard. That is self-evident. But good process can provide strong protection for governments in tackling tough decisions. These decisions should not be rushed, and a government must be allowed to work through the options carefully and systematically based on the best available data. And as we know, the better of our major structural reforms to the economy, like the GST in 2000, came after years of intensive analysis. We believe that the policy development framework we've set out, which clarifies the vision and the purpose of the change and offers choices, will be a useful contribution to this. The single issue or single tax focus of the current debate militates against taking a framework approach, and worse, obscures the real purpose of reforming our tax system and strengthening our budget position. As the election draws closer, our politicians have choices about the mandates they seek. For the last 10 years, we've emerged from federal elections with governments that have no meaningful mandate for structural reform, whether that's in tax, workplace relations, regulation, or fiscal policy. When a business is facing a difficult decision and you're sitting around the board table trying to grapple with it, it's the person in the room who asks, "What's the right thing to do here?" who sets the discussion on the better course. And the question has multiple dimensions to it: moral, ethical, reputational, fiduciary. But the answer is the course that furthers and protects the long-term interests, in that case, of the company and its shareholders. The national leadership model we require is a collective dynamic involving the Parliament as a whole, interest groups like ours, and the community, which asks what is the right thing to do in the long-term interests of the country. My colleagues and I felt this keenly last week when Australian of the Year David Morrison addressed the Business Council and spoke of what had shaped and motivated him as a leader. So let me finish this afternoon with a quote from David. He said, "Leaders recognise that they are the recipient of a legacy left by those who have shaped them to this point in their lives. Role models, teachers, mentors, agents of change. True leaders then ask themselves, what is the legacy I am going to leave?" Thank you very much.